Ethnography, and she has done her MPhil and PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Her research interests are interdisciplinary in nature and include urban and regional geography studies. She was an earlier faculty for area studies, Osmani University from 1984 to 1996. She has visited many foreign countries and has been a visiting faculty in US Studies program at the University of Dartmouth in USA, and has numerous publications. Urban Care, a study of public and corporate hospitals in Hyderabad, Third World City, Emerging Contours, co-edited with Professor Rama S. Malkon. She has also been associated with institutions like IIT Hyderabad and Veshi Research Center for People's Forestry, Hyderabad. Once again, I welcome all of you on the discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a pleasant evening.
Thank you, Jamina. The plan for this discussion is the following. Each of the panelists, Professor Padikkal, Professor Prasad, and Professor Rani, will speak for around 15 to 20 minutes, and then they have the advantage of responding to each other first. Once they respond to each other's papers, we'll go ahead and open it up for discussion. Can I request Professor Padikkal to begin?
Thank you, Soumya, for your kind invitation. And I am privileged to be here today, virtually, with Professor Sheela Prasad and Professor Suneetha Rani, who are very eminent scholars of our university. What I would do today is not to provide any theoretical kind of argument or something. Just to begin a discussion, I would just show a few slides, basically book covers, what sort of books are being published in translation studies and how they are actually demonstrate that translation studies is a discipline across borders, and every discipline has translation in it and language. That's what I'm going to do. Basically, I am having students in mind. I didn't actually anticipate 100 and odd people. So those of you who are already familiar with some of these books, which I'm going to show, please bear with me. I would only say that, okay? Because basically I thought I would present to students of comparative literature and other disciplines. I will begin with reading something that is a part of my concept note to my seminar, which I conducted recently. Then I will go to the slides, okay? The title I have given is New Translation Studies. Translation studies is moving into new spaces and opening up new horizons. The books and papers being published in the realm of translation studies in recent years are exciting and thought-provoking. Our perception of the everyday has been transformed radically and productively by such intellectual endeavors. The understanding that translation shapes and takes shape within the culture, and that, like any other discourse, it too operates within the structures of power, has resulted in a multitude of explorations and research in translation studies, asking new questions. The questions of nation, modernity, colonialism, post-colonialism, globalization, gender, subjectivity, identity, minority, domination, hegemony, conflict, multilingualism, ethnography, ecology, cultural difference, and cultural translation, to name a few, have been raised within the new interdisciplinary space of translation studies, opened up by way of questioning the humanist assumptions underlying the enterprise of translation and the conventional analytical categories used to study it. That apart, the digital communication, speedy travel of text across cultures, and audiovisual translation bring forth new contexts, problems, and issues. Several scholars of translation studies the world over have published fascinating and productive research in recent years. Today, translation is understood in its broadest as well as metaphorical sense to indicate the most modes of communication and production of a variety of texts and discourses across borders, the territorial borders of nations as well as the academic disciplines. In this background, today, I would like to present to you a few significant texts and their theoretical concerns in order to demonstrate that translation today is an integral part of languages, humanities, social sciences, and even natural sciences. I would like to argue that language is at the very heart of any discipline, including natural sciences. Yeah, the first book I want to show is Citing Translation by Tejaswini Niranjana. I'm very happy that this is the book which has inaugurated the debate in post-colonial translation, as well as which actually brought to the fore the question of ethnography, the question of history, the question of post-structuralism, etc., etc. Tejaswini Niranjana distinguishes between the problem of translation and the problematic of translation. This is very important. Problem of translation or problems of translation refer to only linguistic problems. But the problematic of translation brings forth the very assumptions that actually have shaped translation studies as a discipline, as well as the notion of translation. She argues that translation come into being over-determined by racial, sexual, religious, and economic discourses. A discourse inextricably linked. Okay, translation studies is a discourse inextricably linked to the discourses of philosophy, history, anthropology, philology, linguistics, etc. Therefore, we are, especially in post-colonial world, are living in translation. Okay, here translation means a tentative and a stage of transition. Okay, in this we are living in that stage, and continually we are actually transforming ourselves towards a better goals. Okay, so therefore Tejaswini argues that the question of translation is nothing but the question of representation. Translation is the very thesis of Western philosophy. The same notions of reality, language, meaning, and transparency inform both liberal humanism and translation. The next book which I wish to show you is Gender in Translation. In this book, Sherry Simon actually discusses the question of gender, and she argues that question of gender has become very prominent in translation studies after the cultural turn in translation studies. Okay. Then she also further in the book in various chapters argues that translation can be used as an analytical category and methodological term to explore gender issues. So gender issues can be actually addressed. Gender questions can be addressed. The question of female identity as well as agency and subjectivity can be actually explained and explored through the question of gender. A point somewhat Gayatri Spivak also makes in her a famous essay, The Politics of Translation, and also a point Laurie Chamberlain makes in her essay, the the metaphorics of translation. Okay, so translation is actually very crucial in understanding the question of gender and also analyzing that. And if I go further, again, Tejaswini Niranjana has written a very interesting article, that is Feminism and Translation in India, Context, Politics and Futures. Okay, this paper actually demonstrates how even the linguistic questions in translation allow us to raise very important theoretical issues with regard to feminism. Okay, feminism in India, according to her, is already in translation. Okay, so it is a evolving situation. Feminism. Okay, it's an evolving thing, and therefore the feminism is always very open. As we all know, feminism has changed over a period of time. It has actually incorporated, and it was very, feminism is very, in India and all over the world, is very sensitive to the questions that are raised in relation to it, and also the internal critics. Why this is possible? Because feminists believe that they are in translation and there is no final word. There can't be a final signified. Okay, there can't be a final signified, but there could be tentative translations. In this sense, okay, feminism, also, actually of the feminists, as feminists, we live in translation. Hence, self-reflexive, as translation is always tentative. Then she also argues that translation is a negotiation of meanings in multiple levels. It is not one-to-one. Okay, you can't actually say that from one language to another we do translate. Okay, many a time, as Homi Baba has explained in the notion of cultural translation, translation happens in between, or in betweenness is the very definition of translation. It doesn't happen from language X to language Y, or language or the culture X to language Y. Instead of, it creates a third space, its own space, and it happens in in the borders of no man's land. Okay, the same point, okay, she is also making here. So so there is a need to be, for us, especially in the Indian context. Okay, on the one hand, we use the notion or language of culture. Okay, people like Ashish Nandi and others. Okay, we use the language of culture. On the other hand, there is also a language of the universal language of capitalism. Okay, so neither the language of culture nor the language of capitalism can actually resolve or is helpful in understanding the context in which we are actually living in, and to understanding them and also resolve the problem. So there is a need for us to become critical bilinguals. Okay, critical bilinguals between language of culture and language of capitalism. Okay, so therefore we need to develop a language beyond the culturalist and the universalist positions in order to address the question of women, the question of subaltern, the question of the minority. Okay, these are some of the points which she makes there. Yeah, then next two books, this one and also Harish Trivedi, Susan Bassnett edited book. This is by Maria Timesco, and there are many books on post-colonial context. Okay, so I need not explain this much because all of you know. Okay, but this is a major intervention and deconstruction of dominant theories of translation that treat translation as a matter of method. The translation, okay, so here translation is actually discussed in relation to imperialism, at the same time colonialism, post-colonialism, and questions of power, relations, knowledge, etc. being addressed here. Okay, I shall not go further as all of us are very much aware of post-colonial studies. Okay, the next three books which I want to present, okay, are Writing Culture, then Talal Asad's book, Secular Translations, and okay, the idea of, again, Asad, idea of anthropology in Islam. Okay, these books in a way argue that these books come from anthropology. Okay, these books argue that implicitly or explicitly, ethnography was always conceived of its project as the project of translation. The imperial project of writing cultures was self-serving and symptomatic of Western hegemony. This basically comes from the West, and always the anthropological studies, okay, they are biased in that sense. Talal Asad, in his essay on the concept of cultural translation in British social anthropology, has showed how the project of cultural anthropology is the project of translation. He also draws our attention towards the Eurocentric nature of cultural anthropology and ethnography. Okay, so therefore, cultural anthropology is a kind of translation. It is nothing but translating, okay, primitive cultures into the language of the researcher, or in the case of imperial and orientalist translation, to English. It marks a desire to translate native cultures for the European audience. So Tejaswini Niranjana, Talal Asad, James Clifford, Mary Louise Pratt, and many others, okay, many others, okay, and their works support and demonstrate a point made by Derrida. I quote, "Ethnology is primarily an European employing traditional concepts. Consequently, whether he wants to or not, and this does not depend upon the decision on his part, the ethnologist accepts into his discourse the premises of ethnocentrism, okay, at the very moment when he denounces them. This necessity is irreducible. The moment you go into the methodology of, okay, the classical anthropology, ethnography, etc., you are into the discourse of Orientalism. You are into the discourse of ethnocentrism. Okay, after this, people like James Clifford, the book which I have shown you, that Writing Culture, then Asad and many others. Okay, they have they thought, and many other theories, especially the post-Saussurean anthropologists and ethnographers and theorists, see how it is not enough to provide a critique of traditional formation of anthropology, but one has to problematize the classical ethnographic text. They accept the disruption of Enlightenment ideology that claims, I quote, transparency of representation and, again within quotes, immediacy of experience. Okay, this is from Tejaswini Niranjana's book. Okay, so revealing the constructedness or the constructed nature of cultural translations, they demonstrate how translation is always producing rather than mere reflecting. Okay, that is, therefore, critical anthropology or auto-anthropology, as Mary Pratt and several have want to call it, is actually to contest the classical as anthropology, to deconstruct it, to demonstrate how it is ethnocentric, and to produce counter discourses. A few students in CA in CALS have done this job, especially on northeastern literatures. Therefore, it is a kind of rewriting. It is a kind of rewriting of translations. Here, when I say translations, translation includes anthropology, ethnography, history, and other discourses. So there is a need to rewrite these discourses today, rewrite translations. So translation is basically seen as rewriting here, not in the sense Andre Lefebvre uses it, but the way post-structuralists use it. Okay. Then I will come to location of culture. Yeah, this is quite famous book, so I won't go much into the details. All of us know that Homi Bhabha has brought in this notion of cultural translation, which not essentially actually refers to textual or verbal or linguistic translation as much, but it also refers to migration, hybridity, etc., etc. Okay, it is in that sense that Jhumpa Lahiri and others said that we have already always translated people, those people who are in the. So here you are in the midst of two cultures, and therefore Homi Bhabha argued that translation does not actually happens between languages, but there is an in-betweenness which is very crucial to translation. So he talks in this book actually foregrounds the notion of cultural translation, hybridity, in-betweenness, and also metropolitan subjectivity, which has been criticized by a few. But anyway, that what this book does. Then I will go to nation and translation. Several years ago, 1 year before the publication of this particular book, I have offered a course in nation and translation, and I was much criticized for that, and people were just just surprising. What is this? Surprised by this. But anyway, Nation and Translation, edited by Sandra Berman and Michael Wood, is a very interesting book. It talks about the ethics of translation in the context of not Europe, actually England. So we all know that translation has played a very big role in self-fashioning of nations, cultures, modernity, public spheres, subjectivities, etc. All nations are imagined political communities, and cultural translations, and they are constructed in language and in discourse. Without discourse, without language, there could be no nation, no public sphere, no no modernity, etc. So this is a very important area of translation, which actually very interdisciplinary, which involves political theory, which also uses anthropology, regional studies, whatnot, all subjects. Next, I will go to another very interesting book, that is Objects of Translation. Many people may or may not be knowing about this. Objects of Translation by Flood is actually presents translation of material culture and medieval Hindu-Muslim encounter. This is basically, the argument is that the Hindu-Muslim encounter has been represented, in other words, translated as as a monolith monolithic narrative. Monolithic narrative. Okay. But if you interpret various objects that are available in material culture, then you may come up with very fascinating and diverse narrative. Okay. So it present translation of material culture and medieval Hindu-Muslim encounter questions the monolithic representations. It also shows how objects such as coins, dress, monuments, paintings, and sculptures mediate diverse models of representation and translation. Okay, this is a very interesting area of translation. Okay, last MA project, one of my students has actually worked on banknotes and representation of national figures and places in that. Okay, we also are indebted to this particular book. Then I go to Eco Translation by Michael Cronin. Okay, so he has shown that how translation may be investigated from the perspective of Anthropocene. His main argument is that it is not only human beings which are important. Okay, we are in a chain, and environment, the whole environment is important, number one. Number two, all species actually communicate and translate. Okay, there is a interspecies communication. And we should take note of that. And we do not have any right to destroy the rest of ecology and say that we are the only supreme beings in this world and talk about it. And eco translation talks about it. And in recent years, eco translation is actually more and more people are actually working on it. That apart, people like Sundar Sarukai, okay, he has excellent written on science and translation of mathematics, translation and science translation, etc. There are also a few books available on neuroscience and translation. Then we have machine translation, linguistics and translation, etc. Okay, these are all some of the books. And as far as the minority, subaltern, etc., concerned, okay, Professor Ansari himself has written something translating Muslim. Okay, such texts are there. If you look at this, we will see that translation studies and translation is by definition interdisciplinary. Number one. Number two, language is at the core of every discipline, because today we consider that language not merely as something that reflects reality, but it is constitutive of reality. Okay, if we take this argument, the question of translation becomes the question of representation. Whenever we talk about translation, we are actually talking about, or we need to talk about, question of representation, which is actually question of representation is question of all disciplines, including modern sciences. These are few things which I want to present to you, and I am glad that this is happening today. And I thank all members of CCL. It is my second home, as you know, and after Carl's, and Soumya and my very eminent co-panelists, Suneetha, Rani and Sheela, Prasad. Generally, usually when this kind of panel discussion is there, we three of us talk together and see, some kind of a structure we generally give to it. But this time, because of COVID and other things, it was not possible to us. But I hope, in some way, they will respond to me, as well as, their presentations will be also, related to this. Thank you all. Thanks, Soumya. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Professor Padikkal. I think what Professor Padikkal said, that translation is it's not just reflective of reality, but it is constitutive of reality. I think that kind of summarizes what he said. And a reality, of course, spans from like Professor Padikkal said, from ecology to anthropology to, of course, language, literature, and regions. So, with that note, may I invite Professor Sheela Prasad to make her presentation?
Okay, thank you so much, Soumya, for giving me this opportunity and for sharing a few thoughts that one has been thinking about in the last few years on language and ethnography related to region. I'm also grateful to the CCL for always, I think, enabling collaboration across schools, across departments, across centers. I think that is something that we really value as a very good practice and tradition. I'm also very happy that one is sharing a platform with Shivaraama and Suneetha. And like Shivaraam mentioned, yes, if we had been on campus, maybe three of us would have at least, just called each other or said, how do we do it? You go first or I or whatever. But sometimes I think not knowing what the other is saying may also have its advantages. Of course, unless we repetitive, unless it is repetitive. And thank you, Shivaraam, for going in first, because you kind of laid out a roadmap of of translation theory, which is something that I would not even dare to venture into with you and Suneetha here, and in the audience with Soumya, Ansari, and everyone else, because that's not really something that I'm really an expert or even less than an expert on. But yes, there were some things that I thought I would say to just sort of build up my arguments, but I think Shivaraam has already done that for me, so that makes my job a little easier. What I would really like to do is maybe because in this panel Shivaraam comes from humanities and Suneetha belonged to humanities but is now claimed very happily by us in social sciences. I would really bring in a little perspective from the social sciences and particularly from regional studies. And I say this with a certain sense of belonging with the title that Soumya has given to this panel discussion, which says crossing borders. The metaphor of the border is a metaphor that signifies not just territorial boundaries, but it also signifies for us in regional studies boundaries of regions which are territorial boundaries, but not politically territorial boundaries. But it also signifies, movements across disciplines, across languages, and across different field contexts. So I think using this metaphor of the border, whether it was intentional or not, it really kind of sort of places the discussion that we are having today in perspective. I have to, for purposes of clarity, picked out a few key words that I thought I would structure my presentation around. The first one, of course, which even Shivaraam alluded to, is interdisciplinarity. Second one is ethnography, all of which he has talked about, but I'd push it a little more, coming from my own disciplinary or interdisciplinary roots. And then I would move on to translation and language. And I would sort of, when I talk about language, I would draw on a certain, a certain research that one was part of, and sort of how that particular research converges the questions that we are talking about today on language, translation, ethnography, and disciplines. So let me begin by, like I've told you, what I'm not going to do is not going into the theory of translation studies. So if, I mean, I'm hoping that's something that you already have some background on. So let me take the first keyword that I'm using, which is interdisciplinarity. One thing is, we talk about interdisciplinarity as something that which we should do, but it's one of the most difficult things to do, because we are even interdisciplinary centers that we have are still, within quotes, making these crossovers. I don't think any one of us can claim that we have made crossovers or have perfected the art of interdisciplinarity. It's an extremely challenging area. Many disciplines are still very, very protective about disciplinary boundaries or borders, if you may. So these are not, it's not easy for, centers that claim to be interdisciplinary to sort of make these movements across disciplines. We are doing it, but it's a challenging process, and it's something that is a process in the making. But the reason, or the why we need interdisciplinarity today, I think more and more the kind of thinking that is coming to us is because most problems are so layered, societal problems are so layered and complex, that you cannot approach it to understand these problems from a single disciplinary approach. So I think there is a big case for interdisciplinarity, but knowledge of disciplines still continues to be very possessive, and there's a strong feeling of ownership which no one wants to let go. And hence the metaphor of borders, becomes very, very central to any discussion on interdisciplinarity. Okay, so that's one thing. Both, I think Shivaraama referred to Bassett and Lefebvre's work, who talk about, they don't talk about interdisciplinarity, but they talk about interdisciplines. Discipline, and I think this is a very important concept that we need. If we can understand this, this term or this concept of interdisciplines, maybe the process of interdisciplinarity will become easier. And I think some amount of understanding of interdisciplines is happening in translation studies, cultural studies, comparative literature maybe, and also in regional studies, of the few that I know. And there are some topics today, I mean, coming from my own background in social sciences, that that have to necessarily have interdisciplines that are coming not just from the human sciences, but also from the natural sciences. Climate change, today the whole COVID-19 experience, genetically modified organisms, green revolution, and a whole range of other very, very contemporary problems that need a far more coming together of disciplines. So that's something that what interdisciplinarity helps us to do is really two things. It helps us in synthesizing and in integration. These are two key terms that sort of hold or make interdisciplinarity meaningful. Otherwise, it will just fall between the cracks. It's not going to make any difference if we don't have, if we don't attempt to really look at integration and synthesis when we think of interdisciplinarity. Let me now come to the second, and the one that, I think is one of the most discussed, talked about, the methodology, which is ethnography. Now, already we have, Shivaraama has told us that anthropology was one social science discipline that really gave us a head start in ethnography, with its whole focus on field work. And I think the field work and ethnography as a methodology to do field work legitimized a lot of social science research. So field work was given a kind of authority and an uncritical acceptance, which is, I think, which needs to be problematized, because that there is a problem if you just take field work without really looking at all the political, cultural, social, economic dimensions that field work, that are embedded in field work. It's not, field work is, is taken in a very, very uncritical sense. And I think that has to, we have to open out or unpack this concept of field work to accommodate questions of tensions, questions of incompleteness, questions of inequality, questions of heterogeneity, questions of cracks, that we will not know the total picture. So the understanding that, with field work, you will come back, with a complete understanding of the field, is a notion, I think, that many of us and our students have to start revisiting. I think every encounter in the field should make us more unsure of ourselves, should make us more hesitant. And I think if we are open to these kinds of imperfections when we go into the field, our field work may be richer, even though it may be incomplete, imperfect, not fully, all the answers to all the questions are not there. It doesn't matter. But I think the understanding of the field will be richer. And that is something that, we have to think about, both ethnography and particularly field work. While ethnography has had a lot of critical thinking, field work has somehow, been not been open to so much of reflection as, as a methodology. So when we do ethnography also, most of the debates on ethnography are really centered around two ways of approaching ethnography, which all of us now are familiar with. One is the ethnocentric approach, and the other is the cultural relativist approach. So these have both been talked about, written, critiqued by scholars, both from social sciences, from anthropology, and from cultural studies also. So I will not go into that, but what I will sort of flag is one of the, and again, when we do ethnography, we all talk about, we all teach, and our students go into the field as either participant observers or observers to do, to observe communities, lived experiences, daily lives of people that they are researching. And I think that this again needs to be, sort of critically reflected upon. What is the role? How are you a participant observer? What does it signify? What meanings do these terms have? When you go there, are you coming from? So the questions of, authority, the questions of positionality, the intersections that you have between caste, between religion, between class, language. So many of these questions have to, I think, be questions that we reflect on before we go to the field. a lot of the times we go to the field expecting the field will, just, it's like it's there for us and we just go and we, do our research, whatever. But I think the way we are thinking of a participant observer or a observer, these are categories that are loaded with power. If you're going into the field with a translator, there is even another level of problem. But even if you're going into the field thinking that you know the language, I mean, it's the same language, I think that itself there is a problem which many of us are not even thinking about. So questions of how do you go into the field, I think, need far more rigorous reflection than is happening, at least even in, in the courses that we teach on research methodology. So this is something that I thought I would flag. Also, I think at some level, what I would like to sort of push is, it is, when you go into the field in social sciences for your research, you are actually constructing an academic text. And this construction of an academic text or research or whatever is a far more, what should I say, is a far more political project than a translation of a text. So while both are political projects, please don't misunderstand me, but I feel that going into the field and that construction of a certain social reality that you do as part of an academic project, I think that there is far more politics there and far more room for misinterpretation, wrong emphasis than there is in a translation of a text from one language to another. So I think these are predicaments of ethnography that we have to be aware of, and we have to factor these predicaments before we go into the field. So, and I think this is something in social sciences particularly, this is extremely important because a lot of our research is fieldwork oriented. And I think that is something. The other thing about ethnography is really what is the constituting the authority of the ethnographer. Like I said a little while earlier, who is the ethnographer, and if you have a translator, one has to also, question who the translator is, because a translator and the researcher, these are, and then the research, these are the three registers that kind of help us to do ethnographic fieldwork research if we are doing it in a different language. But even if it is in the same language, the researcher and the researched are two registers, and both are defined by certain social power structures. And I think this Talal Asad also talks about social authority. And I think these are important points. The personal authority of the ethnographer is not so important as the social authority of the ethnographer that is represented or that is conveyed or that is constructed in the field. So I think these are some important things about ethnography that I wanted to flag. Okay, let me move on to my third keyword, which is translation. And again here, I think Shivaraama has spoken a lot about translation, so maybe I'll skip a lot of the points that the critiques that emerged, and then the concept of cultural translation itself, which is again something that everyone is talking about right from Asad, Trivedi, and Sarah Maitland, and a whole range of others. So, but I think one of the most important enterprises of any research is fieldwork and then translation. And I think this is like we say, how much a question that should really that question that we should be asking is, what is lost in our fieldwork? We never talk about what is lost, the invisibilities, the absences. These are some things that, we don't sort of focus on. We just come back from the field with whatever material we have, and that gets legitimized as good research. But what has really not made it into this research, I think these are questions that we need to be asking. So in translation, a lot of work, whether it, also Shivaraama talked about Tejaswini's work also. There's a lot of very interesting work which comes in translation theory. Muller also has done a lot of work, and translation itself now is problematized, as something that is very political and highly subjective. And I think if this is the premise with which we start any work that involves translation, then we will definitely be open to the politics of translation, the politics of authority, and the politics of the the researcher and the researched. And I think this is something that we have to focus on. And if we do this, if we sort of look at this politics and look at exclusions, then I think we will be aware of what are the blind spots that we have to really start thinking about in research, in particularly in ethnography and translation related fieldwork research. So this is something that I thought I would flag. The other point that I thought I'd make is that again, good translations are not those translations that everything that you've got from the field, you've got you've got meanings out of them, and you've sort of understood the language of the translator, and you've translated it into your language. I think good translations are those that recognize the impossibility of equivalence. I think equivalence is another term that we in social sciences hardly bring into our methodology classes or discourses or discussions. So what is equivalence? Can you have equivalence at all? I mean, these are questions I think that we have to address. And I'm happy that one is forced because of our crossovers with comparative literature and with women's studies and other interdisciplinary centers, that we are also learning a vocabulary which was not part of our social science research methodology vocabulary. So, and I think this opening up of the borders allows and enables, and enriches, I think, the language of our research. And that, I think, is something that is very, very important. Okay. Otherwise, if we don't do this, when we go for field work, what we are really doing in ethnography and, most of the mainstream translation that happens, it's actually cultural appropriation. We think we are doing cultural translation, but actually we are not sensitive to the context, to the intersectionalities, to the positionality, to the power questions. And hence, these actually would read, like Asad says himself, as cultural appropriation. Okay, now Also, there is, when we talk of translation, there are problems between languages and also within a language. So one of the best examples that we have, and many of us think, like Telugu, okay. So what was the problem? Telugu. But the problem was that, because of Telugu and the way Telugu is spoken, received, understood, absorbed, you had the Telangana and the Andhra agitation, on language. And I think these are, even within a language, within a mainstream language, there are differences, and we have to be sensitive to these differences. Languages are not, one monolithic, homogenized whole. So that is where I think, today, increasingly, we in regional studies are encountering, all these, questions that are coming about how regions, why are regions and regionalisms and regional movements still important in India? I mean, how does one understand it? Okay, you can see the GHMC, you can hear the GHMC elections that are happening. So that's again language at another level. So I shouldn't close the doors also. Let it come through. Okay, the other thing about translation and ethnography, before I move on to my last section, is that their representation is, I think, in the Indian context of research, a very, very big question. So how do we represent what we get from the field? And in that representation is, how do we understand the politics of the field, of the politics of our location and the location of the field and the people in the field. So I think questions of representation are also extremely important. Let me move on to my last section, and I'll wind up there, and then we can, maybe take some questions. I would just like to share my little work that I did on the Dakhini language, which provides a site for problematizing interdisciplinarity, ethnography, translation, language, and region and identity. So if you want to understand Dakhini, you have to, and if you want to understand its spatial configuration, you would have to conduct fieldwork necessarily in the old city. Now, the problem with Dakhini language is it comes to us loaded with questions of inequality in languages, linguistic hegemony, how Telugu pushed out Dakhini, and before that, how Urdu, from Urdu, which was seen as a language of the elite in the medieval and later periods, Dakhini was Urdu that moved to the south when Tughlaq shifted his capital to Daulatabad in the Deccan, and how this Urdu that developed in the Deccan was an Urdu that borrowed from Marathi, Telugu, Kannada, and developed a distinct language and called itself Dakhini Urdu. It wanted to be seen as different from Urdu, because this Dakhini Urdu, which later in the Hyderabad context became Dakhini, was a language that was people's language. It was a colloquial language. It was, unlike Urdu, not a language of, the elite. Everybody had access to it. So you find that Dakhini as a language brings in the whole question of linguistic hegemony vis-a-vis Urdu. And now later on, after 1956, vis-a-vis Telugu, how the dominant language of Telugu tried to, erase the local histories, cultural histories of the region by marginalizing, and Urdu was also marginalized, but Dakhini, which was already a language that had seen one level of marginalization, was even under more threat. And how questions of identity got constructed around Dakhini, which got labeled as old city, Muslim, poor. Later on, there were other labels that were added on, and how a kind of a protest against this kind of labeling, where a Telugu-ness replaced a Dakhini Muslimness that existed in this region of Hyderabad. So, and if you do ethnography without understanding the politics of all these historical processes, the politics of language, the politics of, both the history of the Hyderabad state and the history of the state of Andhra Pradesh, you will not be able to understand why Dakhini was pushed out, and why Dakhini is still very, very important for identity formation in parts of in the old city. And that identity formation happens through Dakhini films. So if you have to understand this cultural phenomena of the Dakhini films or Dakhini films or whatever, you have to look at these processes that are so layered and sort of meshed, which if you don't understand, and you just go into the old city and say, I will do a field work and ethnography, and if you don't understand what is the language that the people of the old city speak, it is not Urdu, it is not Telugu, it is Dakhini. And very few of us understand that, there is this language called Dakhini, and that only if you do, only if you understand the history of, regions, only if you understand the histories of exclusions, will you be able to understand, what is happened to this language, which was part of the, cultural space of the Hyderabad state, and it had also political patronage. So this is something I thought I would just end with, so that, maybe for students who would like something that pulls it all together, this would help them to, rethink, reframe some of the research questions with language, ethnography, fieldwork, when they are writing up their proposals or they're framing their research questions. So let me stop here, and then anyway, we'll take up things in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheela. Not only did you lay out a host of keywords and their theoretical implications, but I think in the last part, you also gave us a very relevant example of Dakhini. And as to this, the title of this panel discussion, Crossing Borders, I should tell you that it is a chapter. I'm sure many of you know this. It's a chapter from Gayatri Spivak's book, Death of a Discipline, where she exactly discusses the issues that we are discussing today from 2013 to 2020. I don't think we have crossed many borders, and therefore that title is in quotes. It's from Spivak's book. Professor Suneetha Rani, please take over.
Yeah, thank you, Soumya. Professor Sheela Prasad, Professor Shivaraama Padikkal, Professor Soumya Dechama, other colleagues and students, good evening. I'd like to take some points from Professor Padikkal and some more points from Professor Sheela Prasad, and move on with my argument, with my presentation. My presentation is not going to be very long as such. I've tried to make it as short as possible so that I can raise a few questions, make a few points, and then maybe we could think around these points. I think it is raining Spivak today. I'm also going to begin with Spivak. Spivak, in one of her articles, discusses a personal anecdote to theorize translation. She says that whenever she is invited, or whenever she was invited to speak on her translations of Mahashweta Devi, she was very confident. She would never hesitate to speak at length on her translations. But when it came to her translations of Derrida, she was always hesitant. She was always a little nervous. And then she takes this as an example to show how there is hierarchy even in the way the translators look at their own translations. Because there is a hierarchy that is already existing in the field of literature, in the field of language, in the field of translation as well. Mahashweta Devi comes from Spivak's own field, Spivak's own linguistic background from India, and probably Spivak thinks that she knows much more about Mahashweta Devi and the field that she has chosen. While she is not that familiar with Derrida, or uh, something that is left unsaid is also that probably when you hierarchize writers, which is all the time done, Derrida occupies some place and Mahashweta Devi occupies some other place. And in fact, this reminds me of Professor Rita Kothari's lecture, that the series of lectures that CALS also organized recently in collaboration with another university. And in one of the lectures, Professor Rita Kothari was referring to the response that she received from her readers when she translated a mainstream canonical writer, and it was looked upon as a contribution to the field, and people were all praised for her. And she did compare it with her other translations, particularly her translations of Dalit writings, which were like, yes, they were noticed, but it could not have been compared with the translation of a canonical writer. For me, Spivak's observation about her translations actually makes a major statement about the relationship between the text, the author, and the mediation. And I'd like to extend this connection, this relationship, to the relationship between the field and the researcher. I think that this statement or this observation of Spivak throws a major light on the relationship between the field and the researcher, and also becomes a major point in feminist research methodology, which repeatedly says that the hierarchical relations between the researchers and the field should be shuttered. The researcher should not be going to the field to teach the field, but should be going to the field to learn about the field. With a strong opinion that the researcher is in search of knowledge, and it is the field that provides the knowledge, and it is not vice versa. Having said this, it just takes me back for a minute to think about the in-betweenness that that Professor Padikkal majorly referred to. The in-betweenness that a researcher could be placed in. I'm just going back to, I think I'm just going back and forth like it happens in translation, where you translate and then you go back and read, and you do your field work, then you go back and revisit it, revise it, and then come back. Precisely in the same manner, I'm just trying to go back to Professor Sheela Prasad as well when she referred to interdisciplinarity, which for me was also like had the echoes of in-betweenness. Is interdisciplinary equal to in-betweenness? And interdisciplinarity at what level is one question that has always troubled me. I'm using trouble with all emphasis because, as Sheela said, that I was with humanities and then I was happily claimed by social sciences. In fact, I would like to look at it from a different perspective. That is, when I was with humanities, I was told that you're not actually doing literature, but you're also bringing in a lot of ethnography. But when I'm with social sciences, I'm also told constantly that you're a language person, you're a literature person, you're a humanities person. And maybe even though you have come into a discipline which is part of social sciences in our university, you better confine yourself to literary studies. No, not getting to field work and all that. No, I'm sure I'm advised out of concern and also evaluating the expertise that I have. But I find it very curious, like positioning of myself. Where do I position myself between humanities and social sciences? And how do I connect these two? As Soumya pointed out, are these borders? Are these boundaries? As long as these are borders, it's possible to cross them. It's possible to connect them. But the minute they become boundaries, I think a lot of effort is needed to break them, to turn the boundaries into the borders. So, similarly, that interdisciplinarity also gives rise to the in-betweenness, probably as Homi Bhabha refers to the liminal space that is available to quote-unquote hybrid beings who are post-colonial, who are products of both colonial period, colonialism as well as post-colonialism or pre-colonialism, and then they find this liminal space with difficulty, trying to weave the two together and also trying to find a place here as well as there. And the in-betweenness emerges with difficulty because while the anxiety is to be here and there, and the reality is that not being there as well as here. So that in-betweenness for me also signifies the status of translation and also the status of fieldwork in a sense, especially when we choose a difficult field, quote unquote again, difficult is challenging. Yes, any field is difficult, any field is challenging, but I'll also come to the point like why I'm describing certain fields as difficult, certain fields as challenging. But before that, let me also see how translation as we are talking about in translation studies and in literature, how it functions in disciplines such as gender studies. Most of us begin by teaching simile de Beauvoir in a gender studies classroom. Apart from many other texts, we talk about becoming a woman, gender as a situation, the second sex. Though Bua came back and said that I take it back, I don't think women are the second sex, but we do go back a lot. We start, in fact, we invoke all these images in the classroom as well as in the research. But we I don't know how many of us mention or how many of us think or how many of us are even reminded that simile de Beauvoir is coming to us in translation. Like Freud has come to us in translation. Like these theoretical texts which have come to us in translation, not only in terms of translation in language, but also translation in culture, translation in politics, translation in context, and which actually extends from our classroom into the research field and into our teaching, into our research writing as well. When I compare field to translation, or when I compare entry into the field as entry into a text, entry into translation, I'm once again reminded of Spivak, who says that every text has a protocol. Not just when you read, but also when you translate, you have to follow that protocol. Of course, Spivak also looks at translation as reading, intense reading, dense reading, apart from translation being politics and translation being interpretation. But when I try to compare field and translation, I'm also thinking, which field is this? Like a text comes to us in multiple ways, depending on the reader, depending on the context in which you are reading a text. Like a translation is done in several ways, in multiple ways, also depending on the target readers, also depending on the politics of the translator. Then, which field and which translation are we talking about? Which field is it? How do you approach this field? And how do you get an entry into this field? Professor Sheela Prasad did refer to the question of language in the field, which becomes a major source and becomes very, very problematic, because your entry, in a sense, depends on the language that you are using. And this language also becomes mediation when you're not very familiar with the language. When I say I'm not very familiar with the language, I'm also going back to the points that Professor Sheela Prasad made. The multiple languages, the multiple tongues that are existent in every language, not just as linguistic variants, but as variants of class, caste, region, politics, age, and so many factors molding language at every point. And let me give an example here. There was a translator who is very well known, very good translator, very committed translator. I'm not trying to add adjectives here, but I'm trying to understand how the politics of language, politics of translation functions at various levels. And this translator, who is not familiar with agriculture, was translating a text, a Telugu text, a very regional specific Telugu text, into English. An agricultural, a rural symbol. Some of you who speak Telugu might be familiar with this word, a very, very rural, very colloquial word like Madichekka, which means a piece of land in a very colloquial sense. But chekka could also mean wood. So this translator translated it as wood there. And it changed the entire meaning of the text, not only the linguistic meaning, but it also changed the occupation of the character that is being talked about in the text. I find it very, very symbolic to reflect on the field work as well. Any field can be represented like this, can be understood like this because of the given location of the researcher as well. Language is the crucial point, no doubt about it, in field work, but getting access, credibility, and information is also, like, it is decided by various factors of the researcher as well. I always wonder, I think Kamla Ganesh has an article on ethnography that, um, uh, one second, sorry for the and I'm sorry, in the middle of it, some very disturbing news. Sorry for the disruption. Uh, uh, yeah, coming back to the discussion about the language and how it is negotiated at various levels, I'd like to take the example of the book Mother Forest by C.K. Janu. There is one language in which C.K. Janu has narrated the text. There is another language in which that narrative of Sikhe Janu has been brought into a readable form, and then that readable form of Malayalam gets into the English translation. So an oral narrative in a particular variant of language which also reflects the culture, the politics, the location of Sikhe Janu. And then based on the reader's expectations, reader's levels of understanding, and the expectations of the readers, it gets into another form of expression, and then it gets into another variant of the language. From there it gets into English. I think most of us who have gone to the field have come this kind of multiple texts, multiple narratives, multiple mediations coming in our way, and finally getting confused or getting thinking repeatedly like which text to be chosen, which text to be represented, or which text do I access, which text do I interpret. And having talked about access, like having referred to access, I think it is the researcher's location, researcher's identity that also gives an access to the field. There is one article by Kamala Ganesh, which I'm not able to give the exact citation, but where she talks about a particular field that she has gone to do her field work years ago, decades ago, which was a closed community. It was very difficult to get an entry into that field because it was completely restricted. She not only got the entry into the community, despite several warnings from others that you're taking a risk by entering into this field. She not only got an entry, but actually she could spend some time with the community inside that restricted location as well. And she says at some point in her analysis that probably my identity also gave me an access. Yes, the privileged access, the privileged identity of the researcher, the privileged identity of the translator. This privilege could be interpreted in any manner. Privileged with language, privileged with background, privileged with exposure, privileged to have an access to publications. It could be anything at any level in the source language as well as in the target language. So it is this privileged, obviously she was referring to her social identity, that her social identity, which was reflecting in her appearance, gave her an access into that field. I'd like to take this question further and say that what if there is, this question comes up all the time, I think, when we are discussing the politics of representation, that yes, a privileged person, let me not take the immediate example because I think it's too immediate for all of us, it affects us in one way or the other. Let me take the Western context. We have several field works that were or translations for that matter, where a racial, a mainstream person or a white person researcher has gone on to research uh, black lives or native lives, then one wonders how many black people and native people have got the access to do the same kind of research in the other background. One might dismiss it saying that no, there is no need, they have been studied for long. Yes, they have been studied from a very, very uh, privileged and biased perspective. What would be the black reading of white lives? Right? That question still needs to be asked about translations as well as the field work, because it also restricts access and particularly credibility. Because I'm looking at it as a theoretical question, so I'm raising this question. I'm not trying to look at it as a personal question or a subjective question for that matter. Um, I have heard questions about gender studies, for instance, or centers of women studies centers, or where there are apprehensions expressed saying that probably Dalit women will hijack women studies centers, or are the women studies centers meant only for Dalit women? So these questions or these statements or these apprehensions are already restricting the possibilities of interdisciplinarity, are already restricting the possibility of entry and access and credibility in a particular field. I think the same questions have applied for long to the field of translation as well as the field that Professor Sheela Prasad was referring to. This, in fact, I'd like to take it a little further from what Professor Rita Kothari was saying, that she got all appreciation for translating a mainstream canonical writer. But just imagine a woman, particularly a woman from a marginalized community, trying to translate a classical text. And immediately, what comes to my mind is Kumud Bavde's narrative about her efforts to learn Sanskrit, which is also a kind of a field which is charged, which is loaded with politics. And then the next point that I was trying to focus on, or I'm going to focus on, is the personal narratives and lived body experiences, which are part of ethnography and which are also part of translations, which are part of literature, very much part of literature. And then why the artificial divide between the real field, the imagined field. The imagined field is also full of personal narrative and lived body experiences, lived experiences. How would I look at a text like Audre Lorde's The Cancer Journals? Would I look at it as literature, as imagination, or as fantasy? Or as I look at it as a lived body experience, as a field work that you are entering into, a field that is available in the form of a book. I agree there is mediation. I agree that in the narrative, in the writing down of the narrative, in publishing of the narrative, publishing, editing different versions for different countries, for different readers, yes, all this is mediation. But doesn't this mediation happen in field work? Then how come a literary work, a translation is looked at with suspicion and is branded as imagination and fantasy and fictitious? And how come the field that we have mediated, field that has been mediated, is looked upon as real and the other unreal? Okay, and like multiple interpretations emerge in the fieldwork, multiple interpretations also emerge in translation, because translation itself is a reading. And like fieldwork, which is actually initiating you into the research, for me, like many other students and learners of translation studies, translation is research. It is not just taking a text from one language into another, but it is lot of research going into the choice of the text, choice of the words, choice of representation, choice of locating yourself in research. I think here I would like to give an example, that is a writer called whose pen name is Geetanjali, who is located in Hyderabad, who is a doctor, who is a counselor, who has been running her clinic in the old city of Hyderabad for decades now, has interacted with the women who have gone to her for with their problems, both physical as well as psychological, have shared number of narratives with her, and she has, with their permission, she has published them as short stories. And then she has already mediated them with their approval. And then I enter into the field as a translator to take these narratives into English. I can understand I'm actually mediating at multiple levels, but for me, this is actually these stories are almost like field work, because I may not have the access to enter into that field to interact with them, but Geetanjali was there who had the access to their lived body experiences, and some of their experiences, she writes some of their expressions in Dakhini. Going back to Professor Sheela Prasad, in Telugu, the Dakhini is retained because the writer has published these short stories. No publisher has entered, no publisher has interfered. But when I took them into English, when I wanted to retain Dakhini and then give English translation in brackets, publisher had a problem. He said, why don't you take it the other way around? That is, you use English in the main text and then you put the Dakhini sentences in brackets. I think one very important suggestion here, that is what goes into the brackets. What goes into the brackets? I think what goes into the brackets for me also leads to what becomes the subtext in a text or in a field, where silence is exercised, silence is used not just as resistance, not just as power, not just as sense of shame and insult, not just as sense of reticence, but silence as a space of possibilities. Many possibilities that emerge from silence, and I am referring to this in terms of fieldwork as well as in terms of translation. I have done a small project on which is actually closely linked to my discipline now, my present discipline, gender studies, gender awareness among school teachers, where I had to extensively interact with school teachers. Most of the time they spoke, they were very vocal, they were like very articulate, very critical of certain things, did not hesitate to correct themselves when, as they were narrating, they realized that there was something wrong with how they were looking at things, and then immediately they corrected. But there was also silence which became very nuanced, very loaded. And it is this silence that I was really grappling with, this silence, when I tried to transfer and translate this field work into narratives in my project. And that is when I was realizing that when I translated a published text as well, literature within quotes, and how I was grappling with those silences, with those gaps, which were deliberate, which in fact were the subtexts which were not accessible to me, like they were not accessible to many others. And they were deliberately made inaccessible, because if you had to access them, you had to, like we talk about it in critical pedagogy and participative research and other things, where you have to become one with the field. You have to become one with the text, one with the experience. How far is it possible is a question that we have always deliberated, that we have always debated, and we will continue to debate it. Text. One more comparison that comes to me between between a text, especially a text in translation, and field work. I'm not trying to define these categories, quote unquote categories, like some of us are categorized, some of us are classified, our expertise is classified. I'm not trying to categorize them, but I'm trying to look at them as fluid categories that also overlap, that also interconnect very closely. It might, maybe we all read text differently, but when I'm reading, I also hear the text, like many of us do. I tend to hear the text where when the nuances also change with the reading, and which is very, very similar to hearing, to listening, actively participating in the field work, which brings the experience very, very close to the researcher, to the translator. The auditory quality of the field, where you pay attention to every single detail. And having said all this, I would like to conclude on a note that is, like I think one of the panelists also mentioned at one point, that a lot gets lost in the field or in the field work when we bring it back, but a lot is also gained. Interestingly, I think Professor Sheela Prasad was referring to it. We always talk about what is gained in the field work, how much is brought from the field, and we hardly talk about what is lost or what could not be brought from the field. The limitations we do talk about, but not in a major way. In passing, we refer to the limitations. In contrast, most of the time, we only talk about what is lost in translation. How it is lost, why it is lost, where it is lost. We tend to search for the minute details also, like where it is lost, but where it has gained, how it has brought a text to us, a context to us. I think it is very, very important to look at these multiple texts that emerge, that reach to us in translation. Thank you so much, Center for Comparative Literature, for having me here. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Suneetha Rani. I do think there are a whole lot of points and issues that we can take for discussion. It's almost 2 hours from the time we began now. People who have questions, I request you to just post it in the chat box so that we can conduct the question answer session smoothly. Please type it in the chat box. I request Dr. Dickens Leonard, faculty at CCL, to moderate the response and the discussion session. Lenny?
Thank you, Professor Soumya, for this opportunity. I also thank the panelists. Most of them are my teachers. Professor Shivaraama, thank you, Professor. Thank you, sir, for this for initiating the discussion in a wonderful way. Professor Sheela has been a wonderful interlocutor for our center and at the University of Hyderabad as well. I also thank the concluding panelist, Professor Suneetha Rani, for giving a certain critical intervention into the field, as well as her own work as such. I without spending much more time, I would give a little. I mean, I was asked to give us a little time for each of the panelists to reflect and respond to each other's presentations, probably a couple of minutes, and kind of conclude a certain remark to open up the discussion. Meanwhile, I request the participants to type in your questions, if any, or alternatively raise hands, right, if you want to ask something. But it would be better if it's moderated through the write-up of questions here. Alternatively, whatever it's your wish. So meanwhile, I request Professor Shivaraama Padikkal to respond probably, but also have any concluding remarks in those presentations. Please, sir.
Yeah, thank you for that. Because it's already, we have spent 2 hours. I don't want to, go elaborately. Very shortly, I agree all the points and very thought-provoking theoretical issues raised by both Professor Sheela, Prasad and Suneetha, Rani. In fact, I think that without our speaking to each other, it has gone very well in the sense that I just introduced some of the key issues in translation studies. Then Sheela has, raised theoretical issues, especially in relation to fieldwork and ethnography and regional issues. And Professor Suneetha Rani, with her experience in translation as well as her various research interests, raised various very significant questions here, and I am very glad that it went on this way. As far as this regional issue, yeah, the fieldwork question, actually the question about fieldwork raised both by Professor Suneetha Rani and Sheela, I agree with them. So one of the things is that now in critical anthropology, the very notion of fieldwork has been actually problematized. And when you say fieldwork, now actually fieldwork is not done the way it has been done earlier by critical anthropologists and sociologists. Okay, they try to give a rationale. What are the questions? What is the fieldwork? How the fieldwork itself is what are the conditions of the formation of a fieldwork and research questions? Okay, such things they are very well aware of it, and they raise those questions. And secondly, the notion of autoethnography actually gives a lot of importance to doing research from within instead of someone from outside coming and doing it. But still, in ethnography and other things, nobody does the ethnography of University of Hyderabad or Banjara Hills in Hyderabad. Still, we are caught up with those hierarchies and these things. As far as regional issues is concerned, I am very glad to inform Professor Sheela and others that recently, there were a couple of PhD dissertations from IFLU, basically in translation studies on the question of Telangana issue, actually. How the idea of Telangana has been translated differently by, different ideological groups and social groups, and why the Telangana issue has become, such a big regional issue. One language, two states, how it has actually. So, such issues have been actually, taken up in translation studies. Yeah, I also very glad that Professor Suneetha has brought in this, this very idea that, very fact that most of the books that we read in our all disciplines are actually, we read them in translation, most of them. And this question of translation is never raised or never, taken as seriously. We read them as if, of grammatology, we read as if, it is written by, and it is available to us directly from Derrida, which is not true. Okay, it is via, Gayatri Spivak, we receive it. Then a lot of theoretical questions regarding translation also become very important. And the final point she made, Suneetha made, is translation as research. Very significant point for me, because generally, no one considers translation as research, because people think that, the commonsensical understanding of translation is that, okay, there is an original, you just find equivalent words, which is not true. As translators, we ourselves know how much time we spend, and it's more than a PhD research sometimes to translate a significant work, and she has drawn attention to that. And I don't want to elaborate much. I completely agree with them, and I'm very grateful to them for raising some of these very significant issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shivaraama, for being very crisp. Now I request Professor Sheela respond to issues raised or things that you want to engage with both Professor Suneetha Rani's presentation, but also some of the issues that Shivaraama had raised. Please, ma'am.
Yeah, thanks, Dickens. But I think we've spoken enough. Let's hear the audience who've been waiting. Then, if there's time, Suneetha, me, and Shivram can come. I think come in later, because I think we've already spent 2 hours, and so
is it fine, Professor Suneetha? Shall we go to the questions?
Absolutely.
Okay. There's a particular question to Professor Sheela Prasad from Asha Singh, and there's also a kind of a supplementary question to that. So she first requests information about this Asha Singh requesting information about social authority and the ethnographer, but she also requests you to talk about Dakhni language, and she has a longer question at the end regarding Dakhni language, where as part of this was as a part of it's a last question by Yatin, I think, who works on Siraiki Multani language and literature and sociocultural study of the migrated community living in India. So she wants to also, this Yatin wants to also know more about Dakhini language and the ideas inside that you have actually referred to in your presentation. So 3 questions collated together.
Okay. Let me start with the Dakhni question, which is, and then I'll come to the other 2. Now, the thing with, Dakhni was, like I told you, it grew out of Urdu, very, very part of the linguistic history of the Deccan region. And it was a language that, was a synthesis, or what you say, a mixed language that had words from Marathi, Kannada, Telugu, and Urdu. And but it was also a language of the Qutub Shahi and the Asaf Jahi kings of the Hyderabad state, who patronized it. There was a lot of Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah wrote in Dakhani, so there is, but a lot of the material on Dakhani is lost. There is filmmaker Gautam Pemaraju, who has made a documentary on Dakhani. I'm forgetting the title, but if you just Google it, you'll be able to know. And who really tried to kind of salvage by talking to people, in not just in Telangana, but also in North Karnataka, Gulbarga, Bijapur, and the adjoining districts of Maharashtra. So this was a language where, if you've heard Hyderabadi Urdu, it is actually Dakhni. We call it Hyderabadi Urdu, but it's Dakhni. Kaiku Baingan. Baingan is a very, very, is a term that means many things in Dakhni. It means confusion, it means happiness, it means a question. So there are certain words, and also Dakhni is a language that lends itself to humor. So a lot of the mushairas and all use Dakhni, if you language to kind of to sort of bring out a lot of I think a lot of identity crisis frustrations come out in the form of, they use comedy really to and Dakhni lends itself to that. So if you look at the Dakhni films, the like Angrez and Gullu Dada and all these, Angrez 2 and all that, all of them use comedy to to assert a certain identity of a speaker of Dakhni who's Muslim, who's been marginalized, who's today there is this image that they are they are terrorists, they are poor, they are backward, and I think it's a counter narrative the Dakhini language was used by these people, by the young filmmakers, to sort of make a statement about an assertion about this, erased identity, which came, in conflict with this, statist project of creating a Telugu identity for Andhra Pradesh. So that's about Dakhini. Very interesting language. A lot of the lexicon of words you can look at. They're very interesting. Of course, it's not as it doesn't have a script, so it's not a language that but it used Urdu, largely the Urdu script, to for its written, so the sources that we have. The question about ethnography and social authority is that ethnography is the point, I think, that Assad, that James Clifford, that Muller and others are making, is that it's not just about an individual. There is also an institutionalizing of the way ethnography is done. It's accepted, so we have to question institutions, organizations, groups, all of whom sort of legitimize a certain kind of ethnography and a certain kind of translation. So in that sense, I think the authority of the ethnographer is not just the individual authority. One also has to ask questions about their location, and that location, their positionality, that kind of then constructs the social authority of the of the ethnographer, the translator also, both. I mean, particularly the the researcher who's going into the field. So I think this is something that in ethnography, and I don't know, I was just reading the questions, and if Dickens, I can just move ahead. There was a question on auto ethnography, and Shivaraama also mentioned about auto.
Absolutely, sure.
So I'll just link it because I think they are linked. So while I agree with you, Shivaraam, that auto ethnography has emerged because of the critical questioning of the mainstream ethnographic approach, and this is now emerged again as drawing on some of the new ideas of reflexivity, self-reflexivity, of coming back from the field, writing your field notes, your journals, where you talk about your experience in a very personalized style. But I still feel autoethnography is still about the ethnographer. Okay, so I mean, while yes, there has definitely been a shift from the earlier ethnography to autoethnography, which is bringing in questions of reflexivity, and that is why now you find a lot of our PhD thesis in social sciences, we ask students to add a chapter on their self-reflexive note, about going into the field, your experiences, as sometimes, you're working on domestic violence as a young, unmarried research scholar. So, and the question, how do you feel? Because many times questions on marriage and violence, domestic violence, or abortions, or surrogacy, or infertility, these are questions that many of the the field respondents are reluctant to talk about, because the minute you say I'm unmarried, there is a certain a kind of invisible barrier that drops. So while I of course feel autoethnography is definitely a move in the right direction, but I think if autoethnography is only reflexivity about the personal experiences of the ethnographer, and are not really talking about the complexities of the field and the people in the field, then I think again there's a bit of a incompleteness that we have to be alert to. Definitely, autoethnography is filling a gap that we didn't have. I mean, which existed and which most ethnographies did not address. Definitely, but I think there's a little more that it has to be pushed. On caste, Shivram, on caste, how do your self-reflexivity, if it does not prepare you to understand the way caste structures operate, the way gendered violence operates on genders, then I don't know. It's not. I mean, so somewhere I think autoethnography, if it is, if it comes with this other unpacking of, an understanding of the field, I think would be definitely something that I would look forward to. That's all I wanted to say. I'm all for autoethnography.
Thank you, Professor Sheela, for this very intervening and enlightening response. Before I come to Professor Shivram, let me you can have a final kind of reflection, sir. Let me turn towards Professor Suneetha Rani. There are a couple of questions. She did a brilliant critical intervention into the discussion. There's a particular question, very interesting question by Fahiz Bashir, connected with what autoethnography, and probably you can reflect on that. I'll just state the question. You brought in Spivak's role as a translator of both Derrida, but as well as Maheshwara Devi, and started off your presentation quite interestingly. This particular question is this, because the way your presentation went, I think I'm just reading into the question, and if Fahiz is there, he can add on. Spivak's hierarchical way, Spivak's reading of these translations was seen in a certain hierarchical relationship. But he's very much interested in asking, in Spivak's translation of a superior cultural text like grammatology, could we state, her word is very important, entrenched in a state of liminality? Entrenched is a very violent term. So would you want to reflect on that, ma'am, Professor Suneetha? That's the first question. And in connection to what Professor Sheela responded to, again, I go back to Leena's question, because I think it's interrelated. Autoethnography as a way to balance the discourse of authority of either the researcher, and since you claimed a translation as a research and a field, what would your reflections be? Over to Professor Suneetha.
That's an interesting question. I would think that I'm in no way in agreement with Spivak, in the sense that I cannot really support the way she is looking at her own translations. In fact, I took it as an example to show how even the researcher might enter a field with all these kinds of opinions and with all these kinds of notions about what is superior and what is inferior. Okay? So that is how I was trying to choose it to compare. Though Spivak was being critical about her stand in relation to her translations, somewhere she was also making a statement that she does look at them differently, the way knowledge is constructed, not just the hierarchy of the writers or hierarchy of languages, but also the way knowledge is constructed. The theoretical knowledge on one side and the kind of lives that Maheshwara Devi was representing on the other side. So I think somewhere in her, though she doesn't say this in so many words, I think the reference to the theoretical works is definitely there in her analysis or in her pointing out that I was very hesitant to talk about my translation of these works. And I would think there is a kind of a fear that she might be criticized, she might be she might be, she might be found fault with for translating Derrida in a certain manner. In fact, I had to connect it with self-reflexivity. The term that I had chosen there was self-reflexivity, going back to what Professor Sheela Prasad was saying. And that is where I wanted to connect Spivak's analysis of her own translations with self-reflexivity. Like how, if translation is her field, how as a researcher or as a translator, she is looking at the different translations she herself has done in a very, very different manner, which actually focuses on her own location as a scholar who is able to negotiate between languages, between epistemologies, between knowledge structures very easily, not just between languages. So the self-reflexivity here is also, in a sense, though she seems to be trying to problematize her experience, her hesitation in this sense, I think her own construction of hierarchy is very openly coming into discussion. And Professor Sheela Prasad is very right. Yes, in social sciences, we are asking every researcher to write on self-reflexivity. And most of the time, self-reflexivity also helps in introspecting the researchers to see if their bias is coming out anywhere, if their certain notions are coming out in their analysis of the field. And most of the time, it happens. Most of the time, it happens. In the case of certain fields, it helps to go back to reflect on one's own self in research, and in some other cases, it doesn't really help because uh, the notion is not going to change at all. It is going to stay forever because it's also a matter of representation, not just studying the field, not just entering the field, but also representing the field, like representing the text. I think it is not out of place to say here that Mahashweta Devi herself felt that her translations of Spivak, she was not very happy with them because the way she looked at them. And at one point she says, I am always concerned more with class and caste, the social identities and the stratification, while Spivak seems to be concerned more with gender. So that itself reflects like how the text is taken, how the text is represented, and how Spivak has made a choice, even in representing a text where the writer thinks that gender is not the main focus, but for Spivak, gender is the main focus. I know I'm getting into some other discussion, like how you read the text and how you represent the text as a translator, because you represent what you get, how you read. But about Spivak, I'd like to stop here. And about autoethnography, I think the example that I gave a little while ago, Audre Lorde's The Cancer Journals, which is an autoethnography. And for me, this is fieldwork as well. That field where no researcher can reach. That field that has chosen to speak on its own. And similarly, a very well-known autobiography most of you must be knowing, so it also becomes part of the mainstream canon. Sally Morgan, an Australian Aboriginal writer whose autobiography, My Place, which is also talking about not herself but her life as well, which is like opening up a field of research for researchers and for the autobiographies that followed a little later, taking inspiration from them. But we also have to, I think at some point, speak about the limitations, because it is not the researcher's field that is opening, but it is the writer's field that is opening with all the limitations and with all the represent. I think that is the major criticism about autoethnography as well, that one writer, one individual assumes that she is speaking on behalf of the entire community that is standing, sometimes the community itself might contradict her. So the danger is always there, that how one individual starts representing the entire community, or one experience becomes all experience. But at the same time, I would also like to think that the term autoethnography is a very loaded term that is very, very useful in field work as well, as a tool, as a methodology, as a method rather, which can provide us with tools to understand the field, that, as we are referring to it in field work in social sciences. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Suneetha, for insisting this very critical, putting the brakes on critical awareness and self-reflection of doing translation and research, and for very critically engaging with these questions. If there are any more questions, you can raise the hands, but I turn now to Professor Shivaraama to give his reflections, comments on these last two questions. But also, since we are a comparative literature center and comparatism is a certain mode of doing research, and then very interesting, you started off with being outside, and beyond the capitalist universal and the cultural particular. Would you want to come back to that framework via after these panelists, raising of certain issues in crossing borders of translation studies? Over to you, Professor Sheela. I think you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, as far as autoethnography is concerned, it is, mostly it's a form of autobiographical writing. But among the, ethnographers, there are different strands of thoughts. And I mostly go by Mary Louise Pratt's, the way she uses the term. Okay, where autoethnography refer to those instances in which members of colonized groups actually strive to represent themselves to their colonizers in ways that engage with colonizers' turn while also remaining faithful to their own self-understandings. Okay, but if it becomes simply a fieldwork sort of thing and simply an autobiographical writing, all the dangers that it is vulnerable and it's open to some this thing. But if ethnographic sensibility can yield important epistemological, methodological, and political insights into our research practices, then that sort of an autoethnography is actually very productive, very productive. That is, so I go, because this question comes because one or two of my students did something using the autoethnographic framework, but their examiners were very critical of them asking questions. Then we had to defend, saying that in autoethnographic research, or when we say autoethnography, Clifford, Assad, Pratt, and many others, they have different notions of autoethnography. And as of now, Mary Pratt's this conceptualization of autoethnography is very useful for me. So it is not only writing something about experiences in an autobiographical style, but you have to also evolve a methodology that contests the ethnocentric methodology. Okay, that is the thing. For your other question, it's a very big question. Maybe I will come back to later sometime, not today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I thank the panelists for this brilliant, engagement, discussion, and celebration of ideas and thoughts. Particularly Professor Shivaraama, Professor Sheela, and Professor Suneetha Rani. Over to Soumya, if she's there, to say the final words and perhaps call the day off.
Yeah.
Soumya, if you're there.
Yeah, I am Rani. Thank you, Rani,
Thank you.
and thank you all. But we have Nargis. It's quite late. I can't see her, but she's the one who is supposed to give a formal vote of thanks. Nargis, we can't hear you, although you have unmuted. Okay,
I think
Nargis. Sorry.
she's lost in. I think she's lost in translation.
Oh, thank you, baby. I mean, we are all part of this, so I don't think such a formal thank you is required. But we are very happy that you were with us. Like Sheela said, yes, we would like to collaborate even further with regional studies, and CADS have been a long-standing, collaborators with us. I mean, we do wish this will extend to other
Ma'am, can you
departments.
hear me now?
Oh yeah,
Got
we can.
connected.
Yes, come on, Nargis. Over to you. Yeah.
Sorry for the trouble. Good evening, everyone. It was indeed a fascinating and intriguing panel discussion, crossing borders, languages, translation, and disciplinary questions. On behalf of CCL, I would like to begin by thanking all the panelists. Thank you so much for your time and the valuable discussions that you shared with us today. I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Shivaraama Padikkal, Center for Applied Linguistics and Translation Studies, University of Hyderabad, for expressing his views and opinions. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Welcome.
I would like to express my sincere thanks and gratitude to Professor Sheela Prasad, Center for Regional Studies, University of Hyderabad. Thank you so much, ma'am. I would also like to thank and express my gratitude to Professor Suneetha Rani, Center for Women's Professor Suneetha Rani, Center for Women's Studies, University of Hyderabad. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Finally, I would also like to thank all the faculty, staff, students of Center for Comparative Literature for making this discussion a fruitful and a very engaging one. I would also thank all the other faculties and the students who joined us today. Thank you and good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nargis. Thank you, everyone. We also hope you will be with us for the next in the series, which will be announced soon. Yeah, we are also planning an alumni session with whichever alumni are interested. So there will be a discussion around the discipline again with our alumni from Comparative Literature. Thank you all. Yes. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.